All right, hello everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about a I'm going to be talking about some issues with conservatism, and I'm basing this off of a video that Sargon of Akkad made a couple of weeks ago called "The Woke Right Discourse is Over." It's a video that's mostly about James Lindsay basically ceding the linguistic ground of the term woke right, or at least Sargon's perception of that, and Lindsay moving towards like a more of a like a Buchananite term thing going on. That's kind of the main topic of that video, but he does go on to make some points about conservatism in general that I think are worth thinking about and talking about. And I'm sure that the odds of Sargon actually seeing this video are basically nil. But I think that what I'm going to say has still, I think, some applicability for conservatives who aren't Sargon or conservatives who aren't even in the UK. So let's get to it. The video that I'm talking about, I'll put a link in the description, basically is mostly about this whole woke right thing. I find the woke right thing to be incredibly non-interesting or uninteresting, or disinterested is not the right word, right? But I find it very uninteresting because it basically just seems like it's a name-calling thing. Like, you're woke right. No, you're woke right. No, woke right's not a thing, but if we had to kind of figure out whose behavior was closer to what we call woke, it would be you. It's like, no, it would be you. This is, I think, mostly engagement farming because I don't think anyone's mind has been changed by this argument at all. It's just a word that's been brought up as a slur, effectively, and people basically trying to hot potato it back and forth to each other. So that part of the video I don't think is very interesting. But the part that is interesting is where Sargon starts talking about his conception of conservatism. And he's talking about how, modern governments provide rights without obligations, rights without duties, right? And he's making, I think, an interesting point. But the problem is that he's kind of confusing the state, the coercive bits of that, with the culture, which would be the non-coercive, the soft power bits of that. This is kind of a problem that comes up with what we call social contracts, right? Social contracts were an idea that, a lot of the early classical liberals had, but the person who really took the idea and ran with it was Rousseau. He basically said, yeah, the state has an unlimited amount of power to enact the will of the people, right? According to this social contract. I'm summarizing, I'm over-summarizing, but that's kind of the gist of it. Locke didn't go so far. He said, yeah, there's a such thing as society, and there's a such thing as a commonwealth, which is a different thing to a certain degree, and governments have powers, but those powers ultimately come from the people and therefore cannot exceed what the people had. Rousseau threw away those limitations, and the reason that we're dealing with, at least part of the reason why we're dealing with such overbearing governments today is that it's gone that way. We had people who were like, well, I represent the will of the people, all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt. And a social contract can provide rights without duties, right? Because the will of the people can say that X is a human right, and therefore everyone must be provided with X until, no matter whether they've earned it or not, no matter whether they pay for it or not. This is kind of the crux of the problem with modern government, is that they're all based on this social contract that they control, that they claim to speak for the will of the people, that they can change this contract unilaterally without any questioning to the people who disagree. It's a very totalitarian perspective, honestly. The issue is that we are kind of at a weird point. We're at a point where these governments have gotten so big that they're basically ready to collapse on themselves from their oversizedness. That there are people who are that they're not serving their people to such a horrific degree that they're becoming large quantities of people who just want to get out of the government entirely and start their own thing. This is an opportunity to move from this Rousseauian social contract nonsense to an actual private contract society for people to break out and build societies for themselves that are based on consent rather than coercion, right? Defense rather than aggression, fees rather than taxation, mutual defense rather than conscription. These are all things that we could be moving toward. But my impression of Sargon's perspective is that he kind of just wants to push things back to some previous acceptable time. I don't know whether he wants to go back to 1990 or 1950 or 1920, right? But that seems to be kind of his position, that things were better back here, so if we go back here, that'll solve the problem. Now, there are two reasons that I want to get to that I think he's making a mistake in this observation, right? Number one is going to be kind of a logical argument here. If you're watching this channel, you're probably familiar with Friedrich Hayek. And one of Friedrich Hayek's great accomplishments was what's called the knowledge problem, or his outlining of the knowledge problem. And the knowledge problem in economics is basically that if you want to be a central planner, there's a bunch of information, like little tiny details, that are all out dispersed in the middle of nowhere. And you just can't get that information, and you can't collect it. Or if you could, it's very, very hard to do so, right? There might be some farmer out in the boondocks who knows that with this particular type of tractor, you need to do this particular thing to its engine every 3 months or it breaks down faster. If you're, there might be a person who manufactures shoes that are really good for a certain specific type of hiking, right? But, the central planner can very easily miss these details and fail to collect them. And so therefore, the central planner is going to be working from an inferior set of information than the people in general will be if they're left to their own devices. That's the Hayekian knowledge problem in a nutshell. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this on its head. Let's assume that we have a group of people, call them communists, who are trying to convert a limited government system to a totalitarian, anti-private property, system, like what we've kind of seen happening gradually over the last 100 years or so. Those people are going to make all these little tiny changes in the way that government works. They're going to say, oh, we're going to make this little procedural change here in this very narrow area. But what it's going to do is it's going to give us a 3% better chance to actually get the floor in these debates for a longer time and make our cases more convincingly. Little things like that. There's going to be all kinds of little tiny changes that have been made to the structure of government that even if you were able to roll things back in a general sense to 1990 or 1950 or 1920, that if you were able to do that, you're still going to miss a lot of these little tiny details that were put in place to help accelerate their totalitarian goals, right? A 3% here and a 2% here and a 3% here and a 2% here, and eventually you have a much faster roll towards totalitarianism than you would without these little things. In the same sense that we have Hayek's knowledge problem, the people who roll government back are going to have a similar problem finding all of these little tiny issues that need to also be rolled back. And so in the similar sense, this is a centrally planned attempt to roll back government to a more free, more responsible time when the problem is going to end up being that now, it took, if you roll back to 1990, right, that's 35 years ago. What if it only takes them now 15 years to roll it forward again? If you go back to 1950, well, that's what, 75 years? Well, now it only takes them 35 years to roll it forward. This kind of thing. The problem basically is that if you just roll things back and you don't make any basic changes to the way that the system operates, you're going to end up having a problem where the roll forward that you are ostensibly canceling out is going to go faster than it did the first time. I think that's a problem that I haven't heard anyone detail before as an issue with kind of the conservative rollback position. And I think it's something that conservatives need to at least think about and figure out a way to deal with that argument, rather than simply ignoring it and saying, oh, we can just get back to this better time, and then be horrified when they discover that the better time lasted much less time than it did back in the day. So that's my like pure logical argument for that we've got this decentralized project of basically turning the government into a totalitarian bureaucratic state, and there have been a lot of little changes that the rollbackers are going to have problems or going to have trouble figuring out all of them, identifying all of them, and returning all of them. It's kind of the high acknowledged problem turned on its head. So that's my first argument. Now, my second argument is a little less, I guess you would call a little less rational. It's a little more emotional even, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look back at what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this desire to simply roll things back a little selfish. And you know, I feel like I'm in pretty good hands here, because when I say that this is selfish, I'm going to be talking about Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, and their positions on the American Revolution. We're going to see that there's a parallel between what they said then and what's happening now. So let's go to Thomas Paine. He wrote in The American Crisis, quote, "I once felt all that kind of anger which a man ought to feel against the mean principles that are held by the Tories. A noted one, who kept a tavern at Amboy, was standing at his door with as pretty a child in his hand, about 8 or 9 years old, as I ever saw, and after speaking his mind as freely as he thought was prudent, finished with this unfatherly expression, 'Well, give me peace in my day.' Not a man lives on the continent but fully believes that a separation must sometime or another finally take place, and a generous parent should have said, 'If there must be trouble, let it be in my day, that my child may have peace.' And this single reflection, well applied, is sufficient to awaken every man to duty." End quote. So basically what the people who just want to roll government back are doing, to a certain perspective, is they're taking an opportunity to end the fight against coercive government, against involuntary state. They're setting that opportunity aside for a few years of respite, and I think that is the part that is really that is the more emotional part of this argument, because like what a person who says let's roll things back to 1990 is doing is they're ensuring that their child has to deal with the same problem they're dealing with now. What a person who says let's just roll things back to 1950 is saying is basically let's make sure that my grandchild has to fight the same fight that I'm fighting now. And this is, of course, a difficult choice to make. I'm not saying that necessarily there's not some reason to make that choice, to push things down the road and try to kind of figure out a better way to do a more permanent fix later on. That's certainly a possibility. But at the same time, we're dealing with an opportunity here to radically decentralize and de-aggressivize, de-coercivize the state, because what's existing has gotten so bad that people are getting to the point where they're like, I want out of this whole thing, and that's an opportunity, not so much a terror, right? Now, I'll give one more quote from Thomas Jefferson, where he says, quote, "All experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed." End quote. This is, of course, from the Declaration of Independence. Now, Paine and Jefferson were talking about the separation of the American colonies from the British state, the British state that said that they intended to bind the American colonies in all cases whatsoever. In the same sense, today, we're dealing with a government that claims that it can bind you in all cases whatsoever. And we have an opportunity to say, no, not only will you not bind us in all cases whatsoever, we will not accept a system that binds us in any cases whatsoever without our approval. And that's the opportunity that we have. So, I mean, again, I don't expect this single little talk to convert a bunch of conservatives over to anarcho-capitalism, but I do hope that they will at least think about the point that I made and try to come up with a good argument why we should be trying to reinstitute the same old, broken, coercive, grasping systems that we've been dealing with for the last 100-odd years, why we should reinstitute that rather than trying to do something a little bit better. Because it would be one thing just to get rid of the Rousseauian aspect, go back to a Lockean system where the powers of government are strictly limited, and where at least there was a kind of, Locke does play fast and loose with taxation, and he does play fast and loose with prerogative, and he does play fast and loose with dominion. But it's a hell of a lot better than what we got from Rousseau's, totalitarian reading of Locke. So yeah, that's what I've got for today. Hopefully this is at least some food for thought. And yeah, have a good weekend, and I will see you next time.